Damn,
Hey.
it's too late. It's too late to close the door now. How you doing?
Calling Chris Anderson in London.
I
Windsor.
am.
In Windsor.
For a few more days, I'm here and then heading off again. And you're in Chicago. So this is like what, 2-3 weeks in a row? Kind of crazy.
I am in Chicago, and I'm going to be here for a couple more weeks. I think
spoiled.
certainly next Sunday, and then I think the Sunday after that I'll be in somewheres in France. So we'll see how the internet goes. Welcome everybody to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help and assistance of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours, and you can check out their history tours at StephenAmbroseTours.com. Chris, I gotta tell people, I don't have my notes because somehow 265 episodes in, I failed to save my show notes.
You didn't hit that one button.
Right. So I'm depending on you for, to backstop anything that we've got.
Well, there was this guy called Lincoln and this guy called Davis.
We're not at that point yet. Yeah. Sorry. But whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening on the HHH
podcast.
Yes, we are glad you are here. And we will be talking about Davis and Lincoln and the last year of the American Civil War in this show. And Chris, I should mention our Patreon Top Shelf patrons, and you can become one by joining us at patreon.com/History Happy Hour. I said that funny, like History Happy Hour.
Oh, you're like practicing.
History Happy Hour. I'm lost without my notes. I'm lost. I don't even know how to pronounce the name of our show. Okay, do we have anybody watching?
We do, in fact.
They all got okay?
And they've also they have show notes. No, Ted's calling from beautiful Fairfax. I've heard Fairfax and I've heard beautiful before, and very seldom together. But good to have you, Ted. Wally's back from Indiana. Ken from Kansas. Cheryl is from beautiful North Carolina. Barry Milgate from rainy UK. Well, it is that. So,
and I see Frank. Frank, glad to know you're recovering. Thanks for the note that you sent.
Yeah.
And Lizzie Borden is there, and Jim Booton from Ontario. Can you say the name of that town? Mississauga, Ontario.
Mississauga,
yeah.
Why is it warmer in Ontario than it is here? I don't understand.
Or here, I don't know. Okay, so I think we're ready to get going. Are you want to give me a cue and we'll get started?
Ready. All right.
All right.
Yeah, perfect.
The bar is open.
Well done. Sorry.
What's on tap? What do you got?
Yeah,
what do we got today?
Well, I'm very. This is good. As we've mentioned before, we don't really often get a chance, or not enough talking about the American Civil War. So I'm really excited that we're going to change that this week. We're going to welcome Scott Ellsworth, and Scott is the New York Times bestselling author of *The Secret Game* and the groundbreaking, The Tulsa Race Massacre and an American City's Search for Justice, and The World Beneath Their Feet, the British, the Americans, the Nazis, and the mountaineering race to summit the Himalayas. He is formerly a historian for the Smithsonian Institution. Has written for the New York Times, Washington Post, and LA Times. He's also currently teaches at the University of Michigan. But this week we are here to talk about his new book. Much better. There you go. Midnight on the Potomac, the last year of the Civil War, the Lincoln assassination, and the rebirth of America.
Scott, here you are. Welcome to the inner sanctum of History Happy Hour.
Well, thanks. Hi, everybody. It's a thrill to be on this show. Thanks for having me.
Really appreciate it.
It's a thrill. Wow.
Yeah,
okay.
We're going to have him back already.
Yeah. You give him a hat now.
Yeah, right.
Did you bring a cocktail, Scott?
I did, but I've got to do some work afterwards. So I'm drinking an Ito N brand unsweetened bold green tea.
Ooh,
and I thought, this wasn't, I don't have a Sazerac or a honey deuce or something. So that's why I wore a tie, to try to add a little something.
I do, but the import label, bold, that's really kind of exotic, though. So that's good.
So a tie makes a cocktail better. I'm trying to understand this.
I'm reaching. I'm trying to find something.
All right, and you, Rick?
Oh, I'm drinking a beer.
You didn't forget
Okay.
your drink, did you? Oh,
No,
yeah.
no.
Okay.
And what
Just
about
your
you?
show
Did you?
notes.
Just my show notes. I forgot my
well,
show
I
notes,
just
everybody. So I'm working without a net here.
I just
Go
finished
ahead.
at the Scotland tour, so up there I had to, add to the collection. So this is a Falkirk 15.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
On the rocks, though, that's
Well, because I've been up here a while, slow melt.
okay. Very good.
All right, so getting started though. Scott, in the book, I'm just going to read a quote that I wrote down here. It says, "In what you describe as a great blue river, you quote a Margaret Leach who describes elements of the Union Army marching down DC's 14th Street. So, and she says, worn, sunburned, high-spirited boys. Their equipment was light, thin bundles, knapsacks, tin cups, frying pans, guns that shone like silver. Under their grime and sweat, these soldiers looked as hard and handy as mechanics' tools, which have been used and will be used again." So who were these men that she's talking about, and why did you decide to start your book with this parade?
Well, first of all, isn't that just a beautiful quote? I mean,
Absolutely.
Margaret Leach is an unsung hero. She wrote a wonderful book called Reveille in Washington, and she was either a member of or married into the Pulitzer family, incidentally, of the Pulitzer Prize. But she wrote beautifully. She did good, hard work, and she was like Barbara Tuchman of the Guns of August. She was an outsider and a woman. How dare her, write this history? Well, I put in the Union soldiers because a couple of things are going on. So the book opens in the early spring of 1864, and the Union Army is not the Union Army of the beginning of the war that was poorly led and poorly directed and often whooped by the Confederates, even though they oftentimes outnumbered them. And you have a new kind of Union Army now. They've learned how to fight, they've learned how to do things, and they're also about to embark on what many people believe to be the last great campaign of the war itself.
Yeah.
So, Scott, so I actually went on Chat GPT and checked this out and asked Chat GPT how many books have been written about the Civil War, and the answer was
And you blew up ChatGPT.
right. They've had to add 3 new data farms now just to deal with that question. So something like 100,000 books have been written about the Civil War. So given that fact, what prompted you to write this book? What did you feel hadn't been done that you wanted to do?
Okay, so both of you pour yourself a drink. I'll try to keep this relatively brief, but there are
Drink
sort of
port.
there are 3 streams that led to this. One was, and I mentioned this in the acknowledgments. When the centennial of the Civil War begins in, 1960, 1961, I'm 6, 7 years old. I'm collecting stamps. I'm into all of this. So this stuff is, my interest was peaked early on. We also made a family vacation from our home in Oklahoma back east, and I got to visit Gettysburg and Ford's Theater and all this stuff. So for a long time now, 60 some odd years, I've been interested in the Civil War and something I've sort of kept up on. A more practical reason, in a way, was that, I'm old enough to remember as a young teenager, the late 60s and early 70s, and how divided we were politically as a nation. But we've never been as divided in my lifetime as we are now. Nothing remotely comes close. And the last time we were so divided would have been during the Civil War era. So that was an appeal to me as wanting to write a history book that would have some resonance, with what people are going through today. But the real way it came through is very oddly through after I'd written my last book, The Groundbreaking, which is my second book about the Tulsa Race Massacre, and kind of beating around to figure out what to write next. And my agent said, "Why don't you think about writing a true crime book?" And I thought, well, that's an interesting, unusual suggestion. I knew Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, Backward and Forward. I'd read some of the, the true crime books that were actually good books, The Executioner Song by Norman Mailer and all that stuff. And these things just sell like mad. I mean, they sell just zillions of copies. It's women who buy them, women in their 20s up until about their 40s. and there's a huge market for it. So what I did is I sat down and I read 15 true crime books in a row, including current bestsellers and all that. And most of them are just god awful. They're horribly written. They're about horrible people doing horrible things. I thought, how could I write something where there's some positive something out of it? But I tracked down two stories, both having to do with serial killers. One in Houston in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Another one in Nashville in the 1980s. And I got close, but none of them quite worked. And I was sitting there kind of frustrated, thinking, well, what was the crime of the century in the United States? I thought, well, maybe the Manson murders. I thought, well, what was the crime of the century in the 19th century? And it was obvious to me that that would have been the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. So I start digging into that and start reading about it. And here's the key. Thank goodness that the Civil War has never been the sole property of academic historians. There have always been amateurs out there who have a passion for this, who dedicate significant portions of their lives to studying some aspect of the war. And a lot of them do really, really good work. And there was a guy by the name of Arthur F. Lew, now deceased. He had a career working for an insurance company in Pennsylvania, was father and husband, all that. But on weekends and the evenings, on family vacations, he decided to track down every single document that would indicate where John Wilkes Booth was at any point during his life. And he did this before the age of ancestry.com or newspapers.com. He must have lived at the Library of Congress, but he put together this amazing book called John Wilkes Booth Day by Day, 250 pages long, more or less self-published. And it would be, Thursday, August 1st, 1861. Booth was in Cleveland where he acted in Hamlet. The next day he takes a train to Indianapolis. He does this and it's all this stuff. And as I read through this book, I realized that our portrait of Booth as this second-rate, second-class actor living in the shadow of his far more famous father and brother, that he's just kind of this lone wolf, slightly unstable, wasn't Booth at all. And Arthur F. Lew had found all this stuff. He sold out theaters across the North. He was hugely popular. Hundreds are turned away at his performances. Scores of women would stalk him outside of his, dressing room and all this. If the critics loved him, he's a genius. He's a genius. New York Times, we've never heard a better Richard III. Chicago Tribune, there's not a better Shakespearean actor on either side of the Atlantic. And I realized if we've gotten Booth that wrong as to what his personality and character was, maybe I needed to start digging in. And it took a while to figure it out because I didn't want to just write a book about the assassination. But the more I dug into the last year of the war, I realized, it's just by the skin of our teeth that the United States survived as the country that we all grew up in. Right. And I thought there's a story here and it's been brushed aside. And it took about 2 years to figure out what threads to write about, what ones to ignore. And then, it got going. And then I was aided in that you can't see it, but if I had a baseball, I could hit the second largest university library in the United States from my office. The University of Michigan Library has everything. If they don't have it, they'll get it for you. And it was just, it was a joy getting all of these hundreds of regimental histories and, memoirs for soldiers, written at the end of the 19th century. They would call them up out of storage and I just got to work.
Well, Scott, I want to get into that because that sort of take on Booth and the Confederate intelligence effort is important. But to be honest, the first half of the book is really about kind of what's leading up to that. And, it's for a lot of people, it's well-trodden ground. You're looking at it again. So maybe just briefly start us off in 1864. What are the, you talk about Grant arriving in Washington, and I think everybody
Right.
thinks they have a notion of who Grant was.
Right.
But what is he about to embark on? What are those first campaigns? How does the year start off?
Sure. So one thing to remember, and one thing that I sort of relearned during this, is that the the end of the Civil War was never foreordained at any
Right.
point. Okay. Now look, the Confederate flag was not going to fly over Central Park or Boston Common or anything like that. But the question was the Confederacy either going to survive as an independent nation, or was the seceded states going to come back in the Union and they would allow slavery to happen? Okay. So that wasn't that was up in the air, and that was up in the air every year of the war. And but at the beginning of 1864, in the North, amongst the loyal citizens, there was a feeling that this is it. We are about to end the war, and there were two reasons for that. One was that the largest army ever assembled in the Western Hemisphere, more than 120,000 seasoned troops, Union troops, were stationed between Washington, D.C. and the Rapidan River in Northern Virginia, and they're about to launch this campaign. They also have this brand new commander, although this commander is not somebody anyone would have mistaken for a modern day George Washington, handsome, statuesque figure on a horse. He's short, he's dumpy, he wears dentures, he often wears a soiled uniform. Even though he had attended West Point, but he spent his spare time reading romantic novels in the Academy Library. He served without distinction in the Mexican War, is billeted out to Vancouver, Washington Territory. He loses all of his savings in the gambling dens of Portland. And then he quits the Army. And when the Civil War breaks out, his career path has led him to be a clerk in his father's store in Galena, Illinois. So Ulysses S. Grant looked like he was going nowhere, but he's recommissioned in the Union Army, gets some early victories, and then solves the great problem of Vicksburg. And at that point, Lincoln says, he's my guy. So you've got this giant army, this great new commander who fights, and they cross the Rapidan River on May 5th or so. I can't remember the exact date right now. And everyone in the North, all the newspapers in the North are ecstatic. And it's a sense that we're going on to Richmond. The war is going to be over before the leaves fall. Grant is going to destroy Lee's army. He's going to capture Richmond, and it's all going to be done. And in fact, the New York Tribune printed this, nearly full-page map on the front page. Must have cost a lot of money at that time. That showed everything between Washington and Richmond, so the readers could follow along day by day as this goes on. But instead, Grant and the Army of the Potomac run into this buzzsaw. First, as you know, at the Battle of the Wilderness, this dark, gloomy, bush-choked, dense forest where they can't use normal tactics. Soldiers can't see 10 feet in front of them, and Lee is waiting for them and ambushes them. And in the end, this horrible, horrific fighting over several days. There are more than 17,000 Union troops are killed, captured, wounded, or missing. Then a week later, there's a second battle, and some people consider them to be one battle at Spotsylvania Courthouse. Here you have the largest infantry charge, ever to happen in the Americas, where you have 20,000 Union troops from 10 different states with 120 battle flags. They all take off to go against these heavily defended Confederate battlements. And what happens is too many people get stuck in one place. And for 22 hours, the Union and Confederate armies are clawing at each other. And there was a Confederate survivor of it who said, from North Carolina, who later wrote, I'm not worried about going to hell when I die because I've already been to a worse place. Trees were felled by the amount of bullet fire that hit them. And during the course of the day, it started to rain, so the gunpowder didn't work. So these Union and Confederate soldiers, again, fighting for 22 hours, are fighting like soldiers in the Trojan War. They're, strangling each other, hitting each other with rocks, clubbing each other, stabbing each other, all that. Grant loses another 18,000 soldiers. So what happens, he's lost a third of his army. And then a couple weeks later, he invests Petersburg with a siege. And it's clear there's going to be no quick end to the war at all. But there's worse news that follows. So In June, a Confederate army under Jubal Early slips away from the Union, marches down, which means north, down the Shenandoah Valley, crosses the Potomac River, invades the north, turns right, and actually invades Washington, D.C., the tip of the District of Columbia, and was within hours of burning the White House, burning the Capitol, all of that. For some reason, we don't know why Early hesitates, but this just sends panic throughout. I mean, now it's obvious to everyone in the North that, the Confederacy is still vibrant. There's still a danger, and this war is going to go on forever. And that causes a great problem in morale.
So again, we're kind of leading up to, but we're not quite there yet, talking about the terror war that the South turns to. But I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about, one of the topics that you brought up here is you spend quite a bit of time dealing with the experiences of blacks, either as Union soldiers before they could become Union soldiers, as slaves who self-liberated. And I wondered if you had done this, it seemed like it was a very particular focus. So I kind of thought, well, did you feel that this was something that was left out by some of the more well-known Civil War writers from the past, or what made you do that?
Absolutely. And if any readers dig into my footnotes, I mean, Shelby Foote wrote a magnificent 3-volume history of the Civil War, an American Iliad. I mean, it's fabulous, but black people aren't in it. I mean, they just are gone completely. So look, here's the deal. The Civil War was not only the bloodiest war in American history, it's also the first modern war. So it starts out like a Napoleonic war with neat lines of infantry at Bull Run, and it ends 4 years later in the mud and the trenches of Petersburg like World War I. But there's another key to this, which is it's the first war where entire societies are mobilized for the war effort. All right, women are very important in the ultimate outcome of the war. They're keeping the family together, keeping the farm together. They're working in new jobs they never had as well too. African Americans are vital to it. Lincoln, in fact, said that if it hadn't been for black soldiers, we would not have won. And the vast majority of Civil War books, the overwhelming majority are military histories. And that's good. There's nothing wrong with that. I love military history. But if you're going to paint a portrait of the Civil War as this total war, you've got to bring in these other elements as well, too. And, I've written a lot of African American history. That was one that was obvious to me that this had not been, given enough attention. But I tried to bring in the experience of women, too. So I'm trying to have us have a better, more holistic understanding of what goes on. I talk about politics as well. So I'm doing something different than a Civil War book that just focuses on generals and regiments and battles.
Chris, can I do a quick follow on that?
Just this once,
and then you can talk the rest of the show.
Okay.
No, so
you lost your notes. Rick.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Thank you.
So you do write about women, and there's two women I thought maybe you could introduce us to, because there are two women who I'd never heard of that you came across, Amanda Aiken and Lois Adams. So who were they, and how did you discover them?
So Amanda Aiken, I discovered her by starting to dive into nurses, in particular, Union nurses during the Civil War. Because much of the book is centered around Washington, D.C. There was a huge hospital right on the National Mall, right across from the Smithsonian Castle, where there were, more than a dozen different wards and all that stuff. Amanda Aiken was, a woman who came from probably an upper middle class family in New York. She was comfortable, but when the war began, she felt that she had to contribute to the cause. And this happened to other women. Louisa May Alcott, the novelist of Little Women. She said, I wish I was a man, I could fight, but since I can't. So she came to Washington, D.C., volunteered as a nurse in Georgetown, and had very difficult experiences. So did Amanda Aiken, who's working, 14, 16 hours a day She's, helping with surgeries. She's changing dressings on rooms at her own expense. She rented a piano to play music for the soldiers in her ward. She's writing letters for them when they can't because of their injuries. And when they die, she writes letters to their family members. And, her diary, which was republished in the 1890s or 1900s, I can't remember, was just fascinating. She write, we had, 100 new patients, 10 new patients today. We're expecting 1,000 more tomorrow. And she's part of this group. There was a man who was the head of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, odd name, but he said something to the effect of, I cannot tell you how important women were to the war effort. These are women who for 4 years, slept on a hard floor, tend to a room, never ate meat or had sugar in their tea, gave up their extra blanket, gave their all. He said their record is too important to be trusted to men. Only God knows what they did. And she was just a beautiful example of it. And I should add that in the Confederacy, there was very much a belief that it was women in particularly who were fighting to the death on this thing and were encouraging, let's not stop, let's not go. So Amanda Aiken was a version of that. I'm sure there's others who have papers that I haven't seen. Lois Adams was this fascinating single mom, widow, who had a family, had a farm in Michigan. She comes to Washington, D.C., and she's going to be a correspondent for Detroit newspapers. And she's just brilliant. I mean, she sees larger issues. She sees political issues, all of that. She had been lost to history, but there was a librarian at Central Michigan University who somehow stumbled onto her, tracked down all of her columns, all of her letters, published them as a book by the University of Michigan Press, which I stumbled onto. And I thought, this stuff is dynamite. I mean, she writes beautifully. So I used her as much as I could because I thought her insights were just so penetrating.
Yeah. So Scott, I mean, as I was reading it, and I should say that, many, many years ago, I was the editor of a Civil War journal. I was always really big into it. I was at Harper's Ferry, and then life took me in different directions. So reading your book, I was kind of coming back to this in a lot of ways. And so reading about the wilderness in Spotsylvania kind of drew me back into the story, but it really struck me, and I was reminded about just how brutal it was. And so I made a note here. You have a quote from a Union officer, and he's about to go into the attack. And he says, I felt my gorge rise, and my stomach and intestines shrink together in a knot, and 1,000 things rushed through my mind. I looked about the faces of the boys around me, and they told me the tale of expected death. And what caused
How did that strike you when you read it?
It just absolutely blew me away, and because it seems so modern to the things that I read about when I study with the First and Second World War, right? And the reason I brought that up was what I want to get from you is it's 1864. These guys on both sides have been suffering terrible losses. Yeah. We've done Antietam, we've done Gettysburg. The handwriting is sort of on the wall. We don't know how it's going to turn out yet, but what is sustaining these guys? They are continuing to carry out these attacks again on both sides. What do you think is keeping these soldiers in the fight?
So there's a lot of answers to that. And also sort of, one reason that quote struck me as well, too, is you often don't have men who are combat veterans talk about how they were feeling. Yeah. So I was raised by the World War II generation. My dad was a vet. All my uncles were. One of my aunts was away. My mom worked for the Army during the war. All of my Little League coaches and Boy Scout leaders and all that. And I could go down my block. Well, he was a bombardier in Europe. This guy was on a destroyer in the Pacific, all that stuff. But the World War II generation, in my experience, and didn't talk about the war and didn't talk about their experiences until after Saving Private Ryan came out.
Right.
And that started to open the door to some people talking about it. So I was, I hit that thing and I thought that gives a face to the war. I suspect there's different reasons. I mean, many fought to save the Union. Others joined the army on a lark or because everyone else was doing it. Others were out to destroy slavery. But I think in the Civil War, as probably in other wars, oftentimes soldiers fight for their other members of their same unit. And that's in the end who they're fighting for, because the larger issues just become too muddied and in some ways irrelevant. If you're in the bush in Vietnam and it's your platoon and you are watching out to get ambushed by the VC, you're thinking about your brothers in the unit, not so much about whether I'm fighting to keep the world safe from communism.
Well, I guess the other thing that really struck me about that quote, and I don't know why I should have been surprised by it, but with very little alteration, that officer could have been on a LCVP going into Omaha Beach. He could have been at Quezon. It could have been right. That I think was a very, I don't know. It was just a very telling quote.
Yeah.
I want to remind everybody that we are chatting today with Scott Ellsworth, who is the author of Midnight on the Potomac, a book about the last year.
He did it for you.
He did it for me, but I just want
you
to point
can do
out
it too.
That I'm no piker. I
Yours
can do that as well. There you go. Thank you. That'll be on the highlights reel. I want to talk about in September, roughly, of 1864, the Confederate Army under Robert E. Lee is entrenched around Richmond, and they've got the Union Army pressing pretty hard on them. On September 2nd, General Sherman takes Atlanta. And so you suggest at this point that the South sort of very deliberately engages on what you call a terror war. So what is the terror war, and is there I don't know how to say this. Is there an argument over whether the Confederacy sort of did this on purpose, or is this something that's widely accepted by everybody, or is this something that you're putting out there that's subject to some disagreement? And go ahead.
Well, everything is going to be subject to disagreement when you write about a subject like the Civil War, which is still a living, breathing thing in our country. And I've spent a lot of time in the South. I mean, I was born south of the Mason-Dixon line on its furthest reaches. So went to school in North Carolina. So I've known, people on both sides of this thing. Look, before September, it was crystal clear to Jefferson Davis and the Confederate High Command that they are not going to win a war of attrition. If they have to keep slugging against Grant and Virginia, the Union can replenish its losses. The Confederacy cannot. Okay. And once the siege begins and things get static, that robs Lee and the other Confederate generals of their greatest asset, which was the ability to move very quickly and in surprising ways. I mean, that's one reason why, plus the fact that Confederate soldiers were incredible soldiers. But that's why they have so many lopsided early victories, and now they're stuck in place. Now, it needs to be remembered, I want to go back to this, that the end is not preordained. A lot of Civil War histories kind of have it that when we have Pickett's charge and the high water mark of the Confederacy, and then it's all over, and then pretty much the rest of the war is a mopping up operation. I don't think that's true, number one. But secondly, there was no lack of resolve by Davis and the other Confederates to keep fighting to win their independence. They believe we are the real Americans. We represent what real American values are. 12 of the first presidents were slaveholders, on and on and on, stuff like that. So they're fighting for their existence, and they fight, after Appomattox, Davis is, we're going to move the government to Charlotte. We're going to keep going and keep going. All right. So they have to try something new. And, the big key here is going to be public opinion amongst Northern civilians, the civilians, the loyal citizens of the North. And, by that summer, Lincoln is, and all the big name Republican politicians are convinced there's no way he's going to get reelected. We got to put somebody else up there. Okay. And so a peace movement starts in the North, which says this has gone on too long. We've lost too many of our fathers, brothers, nephews, lovers, neighbors. Let's just let the South go. Let's just be done with this. Okay. And so by creating this terror war, they're hoping to move that needle even further in terms of public opinion, that the North indeed will let them go. So it's deliberate in that Davis arranged for the head of the Confederate Secret Service, who's going to be based out of Montreal, to get $500,000, and that's a lot of money in 1864, 1865. And there are all these different efforts. A lot of them fail, but that doesn't take away at all from what they're trying to do. There's Confederate agents and escaped POWs who dress up like hunters. They cross over from Quebec and raid St. Albans, Vermont. They rob the banks. They kill one people. But that creates a sensation against New England. And people are terrified. Are the Confederates going to attack us? We thought we were safe. There was a pro-Confederate doctor who collected the clothing of people who had died in a smallpox epidemic in Bermuda. His plan is to bring them to the northern states and sell them at public markets in New York and Philadelphia and Boston, in the hope that he can create a smallpox epidemic. There's trains, or people trying to derail trains, capture a steamship on Lake Erie and terrorize stuff like that. There are plans to blow up the White House. And the biggest plan is that they're going to burn down New York City. And as you know, a dozen or so Confederate agents leave Canada, go into New York. They collect this, pyrotechnic propellant called Greek fire, and they check into all these hotels. And the idea is they're going to burn the city down, and they misuse this. So the efforts are going on. I think if you look at them all together and look at the connections, yes, it may seem haphazard, but they're trying to do anything. One thing, let me just stop on this, is, necessity is the mother of invention, and the Confederates have to work with less all the time, but they're incredibly inventive with it. They're ahead of the North in creating landmines known as torpedoes. There was also a former chemistry professor at Princeton and Columbia, a Marylander, who, once the war breaks out, leaves the North, goes to the South. He's trying to develop poison gas at the end of the war. They're grasping at anything they can because they want to keep their nation alive.
But Scott, do you think? And this is going to get into what I want to talk about towards the end of your book.
Sure.
Is this being organized or controlled, or is Jefferson Davis saying, "Look, just whatever"? So is this individuals acting kind of because of their beliefs, or is there some kind of control or direction or method to all of this?
Well, I think that there's certainly control, and I think there's direction. Absolutely. We don't, there's not even telephones, much less other forms of communication, and there's no telegraphic communication between Richmond and Montreal. So there's all that. This has been written about by, a number of historians over the years, but these books are not well known. But you can certainly see enough Confederate agents involved in these things that these efforts there's got to be some coordination or certainly some direction.
Right.
But, there's a quote in there somewhere from Thompson talking about, the Secret Service chief meeting, Davis instructing him to operate out of Canada and to create as much havoc as he can. So, if that counts as direction, then absolutely.
Right.
So I guess the question here that naturally comes next is how does John Wilkes Booth fit into all this? You've already talked about the fact that he's a celebrity. I was trying to come up with a modern actor who kind of fit your description of John Wilkes Booth, and I got Tom Cruise.
There you go.
Tom Cruise.
Scott says with a bit of a.
Well, I'm trying to think. I mean, Tom Cruise is maybe a little further along the arc, but no, not Tom Cruise. No, Tom Cruise would be perfect. I was thinking
not Tom
Selleck
Hanks.
for
No,
some
no, Tom
reason.
Selleck. No,
Yeah,
Tom,
right. No,
no, but Tom Cruise, especially
Cruise,
younger
sure.
Tom Cruise, right? A younger
Yeah,
Tom
sure.
Cruise, top
Sure.
of his game, well-known actor, celebrity
Right.
actor.
Right.
But how does he get involved in this? And is he, this is something you spend some time on. Is he a Confederate Secret Service agent? Is he a fellow traveler? Is he a rogue off on his own? What's the real story there?
Okay, so the real story, and a lot of this was done by some historians years ago, who wrote a book called Come Retribution, James Hall, and working with two apparently former CIA agents and investigating all these connections. All right. So the thing on Booth is this: he's this incredible actor, this incredible personality as well, too. He's from Maryland, a border state, a loyal state, a slave-holding state. His family doesn't have slaves, but he is all in for the South. Okay, and he has a very romantic personality as well too. But he's also a rational figure. He's not crazy by any means. Booth is also a white supremacist and a racist, and he is just horrified at the idea of black soldiers. Later near the end of the book, when Lincoln makes a speech from the White House talking about the possibility of black men voting, Booth turns to Lewis Powell, who was a Confederate Secret Service agent, and says, "Kill him now." That's the last speech this son of a bitch is ever going to make. So even though he comes off as a loyal citizen, Union officers wanted to have their photographs taken with him. They presented him in Nashville with a sword, things like that. And he had done some work, according to his sister, on his own in helping to smuggle quinine and medicines into the South. But we have this very curious, occurrences where he goes to Boston, which was one of the cities where he was a gigantic star, in the late summer, early fall, and of 1864. He stays at the Parker House Hotel, and there are some gentlemen there who have aliases. And there's a belief by these earlier historians that this was actually the first time that Booth had some sort of contact with the Confederate spy network, Secret Service. Okay, we don't know that. And this was believed by people at the time as well, too. We do know that a few weeks after that, Booth leaves the country for the first time ever and travels to Montreal. He stays at the St. Lawrence Hotel, which was the headquarters for Confederate spies and Secret Service agents. He meets a number of Confederate Secret Service agents during that period. Then after that trip, he comes back to the U.S., and then he goes to Baltimore, which is his boyhood home, and he meets with a couple of his childhood friends, fellow students of his in high school, and tries to convince them to join him in a plot to kidnap Abraham Lincoln. Booth now knows how Lincoln travels from the White House to the soldiers' home. He knows what routes he takes. He knows what the schedules are. Booth also knows now how to transport a person or perhaps a body from Washington, D.C. through the secret Confederate routes, crossing the Potomac River at night, smuggling him into Richmond. He says, "I've got all the money for this. I have all the guns and supplies." Up until this point, John Wilkes Booth is an actor. He's not a kidnapper. He's not a crime, figure. So the inference is that somebody is providing him with this information. Okay. And so I don't ever say that this is definitely the case because the evidence isn't strong enough to go either way. But, where there's smoke, there's fire, and there's a lot of smoke that as Booth goes along, keeps having contact with Confederate Secret Service agents up until the time of the actual murder.
Okay, so kind of picking up on that, Scott, I'm going to bring in sort of a question from Lynn.
Sure.
So he says he wants to know, were Northern spies agents in Montreal watching the Confederate spies agents? And I'm going to add on to that. I mean, were they watching them? If so, how, why? If not, I mean, is something as monstrous as the Lincoln assassination, or this? Had they even thought about that possibility? Or was this? I mean, are people watching out for this sort of thing, or is it so unusual that it's sort of out of the blue?
Well, that's sort of another theme in the book too. So we have to remember there's nothing like the modern Secret Service that happens at that time. Lincoln had a bodyguard, but the bodyguard is not always there. Lincoln was also very much embarrassed when, after he was elected president, and as he's traveling from Springfield to go to Washington, D.C. in 1861 to be inaugurated, that he was snuck through Baltimore at night because Alan Pinkerton had information that there were people going to kill him in Baltimore. And so he was embarrassed by that. And Lincoln was also somebody who had a lot of faith in human beings, and in many ways just couldn't imagine that somebody would want to kill him. But in matter of fact, they almost did during that summer of 1864, when he's riding one night alone from the White House to the soldiers' home. As he's starting around the gate, a gunshot goes off, and somebody shot right through his top hat. And the soldiers quickly come out. They get his horse. They bring him inside. The soldiers go and find the top hat. They look at the angle. They realize somebody was shooting from below up at Lincoln as he passed. And they take the top hat to Lincoln. He says, "Yeah, it's okay." He said, "Let's just not talk about this, okay? Let's not worry about this. Let's not make a big deal out of it." And I talk about other death threats, and there were a number of them that build up to this. So there's a lot of people who would like to see Lincoln dead, okay, in the North as well as the South. And there are other death threats that happen. Now, the Union spy agents, they had there was a quote, a Confederate courier who would take messages from Richmond, cross the Potomac to Washington, or up to New York, up to Canada. One of them was actually a Union spy, and he would steam open letters occasionally and find out different things. So there were some Union counterintelligence agents who were trying to keep tabs on things in Montreal. But there's the country's huge. There's a lot of other places that people need to be looking. And Booth was not somebody that, from what I can tell, came up on anyone's radar early on, or even up until the end of it, frankly.
Yeah. Okay.
So this is a question that comes in from an audience member, and you don't address this in the book, so we'll put you on the spot here.
I've had a bunch of those already. Not with y'all, but I've been on one of my book tours. I was asked to describe changes in ordnance in the Union chronologically through the war. And
if you could get
now
into
that you mentioned that,
Scott, that's our next question. But no, somebody said so George McClellan runs for president against Abraham Lincoln in 1864, and with the Democratic Party. Did he have any contacts with Confederate leaders prior to his presidential bid? Because a lot of people felt that if McClellan won the election, if the Democrats won the election, they would end the war, and make a deal with the South. So do we know of any contacts that he had?
I don't know of any at all, and that would surprise me, frankly. But no, I don't know of any. But a great question.
Okay, and since that was such a short answer, I will.
You said you only okay.
I don't know. Okay, never mind.
No. I insist.
I have
insist.
not. No, I will. No, I'm done.
No, you've already opened the door. Nope.
No.
All right. So you say, Scott. Now, as I hope everyone watching knows, John Wilkes Booth unfortunately does assassinate.
You give away the end of the book. You're not supposed to do that.
And there are things that happen as a result. But ultimately, of course, it's at the moment of Union victory, and you'll get into that very eloquently in the book. But you say in the book, the conspirators had failed. So too had Jefferson Davis and Lee and all the rest. The secessionist politicians and planters, the traitorous former U.S. Army officers, and all those who had gone along with them. They had fought for an older version of America. So what was the older version? And if that was the past, what then was the future?
Well, the older version of America was certainly one in which slavery was a central aspect of it. There's, part of when you're dealing with this material, we've all been so, um, everything has been so shaded by the era of the lost cause, which, to remind everyone, the first, in the 19th century, everyday civilians in the North and the West considered the Confederates to be traitors, many of whom felt that they should have been executed or imprisoned and things like that. What happens in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, there's this movement called the Lost Cause, and it's promulgated by Southern politicians and businessmen who get help with other Northerners as well too, who go along. And now the Confederates are no longer traitors; they're going to become American heroes. A statue of Jefferson Davis appears in the U.S. Capitol. The United States Mint makes a commemorative $50 dedicated to the valor of the soldier of the South. It has an engraving of Lee and Stonewall Jackson, and behind them is Stone Mountain, Georgia. This is when all of these monuments go up all over across the South to Confederate soldiers. And what happens with this is that then the war sort of gets changed. It's no longer it's about slavery. It's really an unfortunate, argument that should never have happened between white men in the North and white men in the South over states' rights and things like that. Now, there is a problem with how you're going to change the narrative on this. One way, I mean, people in the South, there were plenty of people who were celebrated when Lincoln was murdered. They were thrilled to have that happen. Then it becomes, no, white Southerners were sad that Lincoln was killed because they thought he would be nicer to them when the war ended. That becomes the thing. But you have a problem. It's very hard to paint over somebody going up behind a person sitting watching a comedy in a theater and putting a bullet in the back of their brain. It's hard to turn that into a heroic act. So what happens is that Lee, now he's completely divorced from any connections to the Confederacy at all. He's divorced. The fact that he signed one of his sort of missives to himself as a Confederate, the fact that he traveled and met Confederate agents in Canada, probably in New York City, in Baltimore, in Washington, D.C., in Southern Maryland, all of that gets pushed aside. And instead, you've got this sort of, archetype of a John Hinckley or a Sarah Jane Moore or a Lee Harvey Oswald who's doing this act, and it has nothing to do with the war. And so this plays into how we look at the war and what's going on. The Civil War, as everybody knew at the time, that slavery is the root cause of it. Of course, disunion is very important, but that gets wiped away for a long time. And it's only in recent decades that we're starting to recognize that fact.
So
they're also fighting for an agrarian version of America, that's not big cities. They're not into all these immigrants that are streaming in to the cities as well, too. It's a very legitimate view. It's just the one that didn't win.
Yeah, and you have another quote that's near where the one that Chris was just reading from, and they're talking about slavery and how slavery was a brutal system of captivity, and then talking about Lee and Davis and the rest of the Confederate generals, and they had loved it, slavery. They had loved it enough to betray their flag, turn their backs on their sacred oaths, and take up arms against their brothers and sisters. So clearly, you have very strong feelings about this. And I would say to you, what is the lesson for today that we should take from the last year of the Civil War from your book?
Well, at first, this would be like the equivalent of Patton deciding to turn the Third Army around and to attack, Montgomery or Eisenhower or something like that. I mean, this is a shocking change to have these, incredibly well-respected United States Army officers to take up arms against their fellow West Point classmates, people they had led into battle. I mean, this is a major thing. So in my view, I think there's a couple things that we need to remember and to learn from this. First, and I don't talk about this, but this is important, that freedom of speech died in the South in the 1850s. You couldn't criticize slavery. That was it. It was over. There was it was like there was one channel that everybody could listen to and one version of the news. Okay. So the division in terms of how people viewed the world was very much the same. But in the end, what struck me, of course, Lincoln is a key figure in this. I mean, he's our greatest president by far. I don't know if we deserve someone of his brilliance. Grant is important. Sherman is, that all these big names are. But what I became so impressed by was that there was this remarkable and unprecedented coalition of men and women in uniform and out, blacks and whites, native born and immigrant, free and unfree, who were able to form a coalition, and together they defeat the Confederacy, they destroy slavery. 1 out of every 7 Americans goes from being enslaved to being free during the Civil War. They preserve the Union, and they give us a new beginning in terms of trying to do a better job of staying true to our founding ideals. So I think part of it has to do with different groups toning down some of their own personal group interests and joining together with a common cause to fight the battle that had to be fought. And that's why I was so impressed by the likes of Amanda Aiken, so impressed by the likes of Charles Gilbert Gould, who was this Vermont farm boy who lies about his age, joins the Union Army at age 16. By the time he's 19 at Petersburg, he's a captain. He pierces the Confederate line and starts to end to the end of the war in Virginia. There's so many people like that who sacrifice so much. And these are our American heroes. All of us stand on their shoulders. And in this sort of cynical moment, we need to remember them because they really gave us the great gift of this country that we've been so fortunate to grow up in.
Well, Scott Ellsworth, well said. Thank you very much for joining us today. And Scott,
I had one more question. About
So sorry.
About ordnance in the Civil War.
Okay.
Sorry.
Scott
That's
is
the
the
next book.
Scott is the author of Midnight on the Potomac, The Last Year of the Civil War, The Lincoln Assassination, and the Rebirth of America. You've been a terrific guest, Scott. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Our great pleasure. And Chris, I don't have notes here, but I do know that next week we are bringing back an esteemed British historian.
Oh, good. I like to see British historians.
Richard Overy, who is the author of a new book called Reign of Ruin, Tokyo, Hiroshima, and the Surrender of Japan. He was on with us a couple of years ago, I'm going to say 2-3 years ago. And obviously spent that time writing a new book.
Yeah, and that book has been getting an awful lot of conversation over here. He's an outstanding historian, and it's a great book, and it will cause you to think. So
yeah, looking forward to digging into that, and of course to getting back to World War II. I mean, okay,
right. I'm a little out of my comfort zone here.
Yeah.
50 whole minutes.
All right. I mean, can you talk a little bit about the muzzle velocity of a?
I'm gonna go read up on that now.
All right. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining us today. I don't have my notes, so I can't give you my usual blah, blah, blah at the end. But thank you very much for checking us out. Check us out on the website, historyhappyhour.com. And we appreciate you watching the show.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.